It arrived mid-morning, tucked amongst the more pedestrian post, a circular from the Church Restoration Committee, a neatly folded bill from the greengrocer, and then, rather incongruously, an envelope of heavy ivory paper bearing a once familiar hand. Miss Marple paused, teacup in hand, as her eyes traced the delicate loop of the capital A. Ada Hesketh, of course. It had been years. Inside, a note, scented faintly of lavender sachets, and a trace of something older. My dear Jane, I do hope this finds you well. We are hosting a small meeting of our Biscuit Club on Thursday afternoon, and your presence would lend such charm and precision as I remember it. I hope you'll come. It has been too long since shortbread solved anything between us. Miss Marple smiled softly. It was not every day that a woman of her age received an invitation that carried with it both nostalgia and the suggestion of unfinished conversation. And though she had no taste for gossip, she had, of course, always found biscuits, and those who baked them, to be curiously revealing. The old rectory stood precisely as she remembered it, a little more ivy perhaps, a little more weather at the eaves, but otherwise unchanged. The drawing-room smelled of beeswax and bergamot, and the tablecloths had been ironed into submission. Lady Ada, still upright as ever, met her with both hands and a crisp kiss on the cheek. "You've not changed," she said, though her eyes held something more complex than compliment. Miss Marple was ushered in with polite ceremony and seated beside a samovar that hissed with understated menace. The Biscuit Club, it seemed, observed ritual with almost ecclesiastical devotion. A footed silver tray bore lace doilies upon which perched rosewater creams, chocolate thins, almond buttons, and something called a Sussex snap, a local creation that shattered pleasingly under tooth. Only one per guest at first serving. Lady Ada intoned gently, and a few guests chuckled. There were 12 members, all told. 11 now, of course, she remembered. Old Mr. Broom having passed away last spring, likely from embarrassment at a failed macaron. Politeness clinked from cup to saucer as tea was poured and queries exchanged. All very civil, very practiced, and yet beneath the hum of trivialities, Miss Marple sensed the faintest undertow, something not quite said, though carefully skirted. She had always believed that a tea party revealed far more than a confession. The way one folded a napkin or declined a second biscuit was, to Miss Marple's mind, more illuminating than a diary. To her left sat Mr. Percival Flint, a dapper man with a precise moustache, who had once been a solicitor in Exeter. He examined each biscuit as if it were a forged document before selecting the plainest. His eyes flickered across the room often, like a man checking exits. Opposite him, the widow of the late vicar, Mrs. Biscuit, poured her tea with a delicate tremor and a careful eye. There was a humility to her that seemed more practiced than instinctive, as though worn like a brooch she had forgotten how to remove. Beside her, Miss Agatha Grove, head mistress retired, had the posture of a woman still grading everyone silently. She was formidable, her hands folded, her expression one of poised neutrality, though she looked once or twice at the younger member, Mrs. Eloise Denham, with the cool patience of someone waiting to be disappointed. And Eloise, she of the pale gloves and whispery smile, rarely spoke. But when she did, the others fell a shade quieter. Miss Marple sipped her tea and nodded gently. It was not what was said, she had always found. It was who stayed silent that told the truth. "I suppose we shan't be seeing the cinnamon syllabub again," murmured Mr. Flint into his saucer. It was a quiet remark not meant for attention, but it caught it all the same. A strange stillness rippled through the group, like the hush before a hymn begins. Lady Ada's spoon paused mid-air. Miss Grove stiffened almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Biscuit cleared her throat. Only Eloise Denham kept her smile, but her fingers cuffed slightly around her teaspoon. "Oh, it was just a recipe," someone said. Miss Grove, a beat too late. "Lost ages ago, I believe." Miss Marple looked down at the plate of biscuits, now oddly diminished despite the hour. The almond buttons had vanished with more speed than seemed strictly appropriate. "Lost things," she said softly, "often have a way of being remembered just at the wrong moment." Nobody answered. The silence was not angry, precisely, but it was taut, the sort one finds at funerals where one mourner has not been invited. Then Lady Ada clapped her hands gently and declared that a second serving was warranted, so long as no one touches the rose creams before Miss Grove has had her turn. A few chuckles followed. The tension receded, but not entirely. With due ceremony, Lady Ada unveiled the club's silver biscuit barrel, a gleaming heirloom that dated, she announced, from Queen Mary's kitchen itself. It was passed down the table, admired, opened with reverence, and served from with measured grace. But as Miss Marple accepted it in turn, her eyes caught something curious. Near the lid's rim, just below the elaborate crest of intertwining vines, there was a faint grey smear, as though someone had attempted to polish away a fingerprint, but had not quite succeeded. The surface shone, but unevenly. The cloth had missed a corner. Most would not have noticed. Certainly none at the table seemed to. But Miss Marple's mind worked like a pattern knitter's, trained to detect the one dropped stitch in an otherwise perfect row. She turned the barrel gently, noting that the smudger sang near the clasp, not where one would hold it to pass, but where one might press something inside or take something out. The next guest took the barrel with a polite nod. Miss Marple let it go, her smile undisturbed. She reached for her cup again, but found her tea had gone cold. An odd thing that she could not recall putting it down. Conversation resumed its civil rhythm. Remarks about hydrangeas, the unreliability of the local bus, the peculiar failure of a recent sponge. But the laughter was thinner now, and the teacups rang louder in their saucers. Miss Marple sat back, letting the current drift around her. She observed the way Mr. Flint reached for a biscuit without looking, yet chose one not offered by Lady Ada, but from Mrs. Denham's plate, a small thing, yet not careless. She noticed how Miss Grove began a story about her years in Yorkshire, only to abandon it halfway, when Mrs. Biscuit interjected with an anecdote about a cat named Fluffernutter. Fluffernutter, it seemed, had never existed, and Eloise Denham, still pale, still silent, had eaten not a single biscuit, though she had touched 3. It was not the words that troubled Miss Marple, it was their absence, the choreographed way certain stories began and were not finished, how some glances were a fraction too brief, and how Lady Ada, for all her charm, never once mentioned Percival Flint's name. Outside the window, a sparrow darted toward the sill and flew off again, unsettled by its own reflection. Miss Marple folded her napkin. There would be more crumbs to gather. It was the housemaid who found him. The breakfast tray balanced in her trembling hands. She had knocked twice on the study door, gently, then with growing boldness, before nudging it open and stepping into a silence that seemed to press against her throat. Mr. Percival Flint sat upright at his desk, pen poised in hand, as though deep in thought. But the blot of ink beneath his nib had long dried, and his spectacles had slipped ever so slightly down his nose. The fire in the grate had burned to ash. A single curtain had been pulled against the morning sun, and the clock on the mantel had ticked several minutes beyond the hour without acknowledgment. When Miss Marple heard the news, carried on the fine lace thread of St. Mildred's gossip circuit, she said nothing at first, but she remembered, with a kind of stillness, the way Mr. Flint had looked at her as he declined a second biscuit just 2 days prior, not with suspicion, but with the hollow eyes of a man who knows a storm is coming and has already begun to pack his soul away. Dr. Lee arrived in his usual manner, brisk, officious, and slightly weary from the early call. He greeted Lady Ada with a murmured condolence and accepted tea, though he left it untouched. The body had already been arranged for dignity's sake, the study restored to a semblance of order. It was only the untouched pen and the faintest blue tinge at the edge of Mr. Flint's lips that seemed to resist narrative. "A man of his age," said Dr. Lee, unscrewing the cap of his fountain pen with more care than was strictly necessary, "with a history of mild arrhythmia. I dare say strain of mind may have played a role." He hesitated before writing, just a flicker, the pause of a man weighing something invisible in his hand. Then, almost too quickly, he scrawled the cause: cardiac failure, natural causes. Miss Marple, who had arrived under the gentle pretext of offering assistance with condolence notes, happened to be in the hallway when the doctor passed her. She offered a polite smile and a quiet, "Good morning," but her eyes were already elsewhere, fixed on the still damp nib of his pen and the nervous way he capped it. That evening, Miss Marple sat by the hearth in her parlor, the light dimmed low, and her knitting left idle in her lap. Outside, the wind stirred the privet hedge with a restless whisper. Inside, her thoughts returned, not to death itself, which she had grown used to in its various forms, but to the peculiar sound Mr. Flint had made at the last club meeting. It had been a cough, to be sure, but not one born of age or throat. It was sharp, urgent, almost panicked, and it had interrupted Lady Ada just as she had begun to recount a tale about rose-petal shortbread. What had been more curious than the cough was the silence that followed it. Not the concerned hush of friends, but the subtle recoil of people who had perhaps heard more than was intended. Miss Marple had looked up from her plate then, and seen Mr. Flint's face, not flushed, but pale, and his eyes not watering but fixed. He had recovered quickly, planing a crumb down the wrong pipe, but the mood of the gathering had never quite returned to its earlier ease. Now, in the gentle hush of her own parlor, Miss Marple wondered what truth had nearly choked him. The Biscuit Club gathered again that Thursday, a half-ghost of its former self. The chairs had been shifted slightly to account for the gap at the table, but no one remarked on the change. The lemon wafers sat untouched in their tin, a gesture Lady Ada described as a tribute to Percival's favorite, yet no one reached for them. Lady Ada herself presided with her usual poise, but Miss Marple noted how her voice caught slightly when introducing the meeting's purpose: to honor our dear friend with the very continuity he cherished. Her gloved hands lingered too long on the biscuit barrel, polishing the lid though it already gleamed. Conversation was sparse and strained. Mrs. Biscuit offered a story about church bazaars of yesteryear, and Miss Grove corrected her with unnecessary sharpness over the date. The others listened politely, but with minds elsewhere, some in the study where death had come too quietly, some perhaps in memories of things they hoped had died long ago. Miss Marple sat with her knitting untouched, and her teacup full, the threads of her observation gathering more firmly with each careful sip. It was not grief she sensed, nor affection. It was obligation, and something under it, older still. Percival's chair remained at the far end of the hearth, high-backed, its leather worn to a polish by decades of habit. No one sat in it. Yet it was not the chair's emptiness that gave Miss Marple pause. It was how the room had already rearranged itself around the absence. A newer member, Mr. Carraway, had shifted slightly into the conversational space Mr. Flint once filled, offering observations with a confidence not previously exhibited. Mrs. Denham had grown quieter still, folding her napkin into more intricate creases than necessary. Even Lady Ada, so precise in her rituals, omitted Percival's name in the list of those missed. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the mantel above the hearth, where a clock ticked too fast, and a vase of snapdragons tilted at an odd angle. Everything looked the same, yet moved differently, like a theatre troupe performing without its prompter. She recalled a line from Tennyson that she had once clipped into a notebook. The past is not dead, it is not even past. She let her gaze fall to the chair again. It was not mourning that filled the space, it was concealment, and concealment, in her experience, was rarely born of innocence. Lady Ada rose, teacup in hand, and cleared her throat with quiet resolve. To Percival, she said, who believed in order and resolve. To Percival, she said, who believed in order, in ritual, and in the healing power of almond essence. There was a ripple of polite laughter, too brief, too uniform. Cups were lifted, nods exchanged, and for a moment the circle of porcelain and propriety held firm. Miss Marple raised her cup as well, but her eyes wandered the table as the others sipped. It was in that brief moment of lifted chins and lowered eyes that she saw it, the flicker of relief in Mrs. Eloise Denham's expression. Not joy, not satisfaction, but a soft exhale, like a weight had shifted from one shoulder to the other. Eloise caught herself quickly and returned to her usual quietude, but Miss Marple had seen it, and if one moment could carry the whole shape of guilt, that was it. The tea tasted faintly of lemon balm, but its warmth did not linger. Miss Marple set down her cup gently and folded her hands. Whatever had been buried with Percival Flint had not stayed beneath the surface, and the truth, she thought, had a way of seeping through, just like the bitter edge of overbrewed tea. It was mid-morning when Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Eloise Denham near the butcher's, delicately choosing lamb chops, as though one might judge a soul by its cut. Miss Marple, with her usual smile, greeted her warmly and asked, as if the thought had only just occurred, whether the meringues she had brought to the last meeting had turned out well. Meringues? Mrs. Denham echoed, a shade too quickly. Oh, I believe I made rose biscuits that afternoon. Or was it shortbread? Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, her expression mildly apologetic. How odd! I was certain I saw you with a lemon meringue tin. You always did favor the piped ones. Mrs. Denham flushed faintly. Oh yes, now you mention it. I had started those, but I believe I changed my mind at the last moment. They were rather soft. The statement was plausible, polite, forgetful. And yet, Miss Marple's mind lingered not on the switch of sweets, but on the hesitation between yes and I believe. It was a meringue tin, it had been lemon, but it had not been mentioned, and in a room where silence often served as a safer substitute for truth, that omission had a weight all its own. Later that same day, under the guise of delivering a jar of rosehip jelly, Miss Marple paid a call to the rectory. The housemaid, a slight girl named Gwen, with the fragile nerves of someone raised to listen more than speak, answered the door and took the jar with thanks that trembled. Miss Marple, who never wasted a kind face, asked after her mother's ankle, which she had heard was troubling her. Gwen responded earnestly, her words eager and grateful, and somewhere in the reassurance, her guard lowered. It must be odd, Miss Marple said, not to see Mr. Flint come and go any more. I always thought he looked so very regular, like a metronome in a grey suit. The girl hesitated. Yes, miss. Always wore the same hat. Never used the side gate, though it's closer to his house. Miss Marple allowed her smile to fade into mild curiosity. Though I did wonder, Gwen, were you on duty the night before he passed? Did you notice anyone in the garden, perhaps? There was a pause, then the slightest nod. I thought I saw someone, Gwen whispered, just past the lilac hedge. A woman, I think, or a tall man with a scarf. It was dusk. Did you recognize the figure? Gwen's eyes darted. No, miss. I was drawing the curtains. I didn't see their face, but Miss Marple, who had once read guilt in the way a boy overbuttoned his coat, noted it wasn't the face Gwen was frightened of. It was the memory. The following afternoon, Miss Marple found herself in the company of Mrs. Clarice Vale, a woman whose almond biscuits were as admired as her stubborn refusals to join local committees. They sat in Clarice's sunlit parlor, sipping weak tea and discussing recipes with the vague detachment of former friends treading carefully around a rift neither of them had sown. "Oh, I brought my usual to the last club meeting," Clarice said firmly. "Almond and oat, the ones I've done since '47. Percival always said they were his favorite." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unreadable. "I imagine they vanished rather quickly then." Clarice smiled. "Didn't see them on the tray, mind you, but I handed them over to Lady Ada's girl myself." "Curious," Miss Marple mused, "because I noticed none were served, and Lady Ada was quite sure your tin was the one that went out first." Clarice blinked. "Then it was swapped, wasn't it?" Miss Marple nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the edge of her teacup. "That's what I rather think." There was silence between them, not hostile, but thick. In Miss Marple's experience, biscuit tins, like secrets, were best observed in who handled them and who did not. Lady Ada received Miss Marple in the conservatory, her gloves folded in her lap, and a sprig of lavender trembling slightly in the small crystal vase beside her. The air smelled faintly of lemon oil and something else, more metallic, less floral. "I do appreciate you calling," Lady Ada said. "It's been difficult keeping things in order. There's such an absence where Percival once was." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "It's the quiet that gets one, I always think, and the peculiar things left behind. A smudge on a mirror, or a biscuit barrel that shines a little too much." Lady Ada's fingers flinched, ever so slightly. "I did polish it," she said after a pause. "This morning, actually. Habit." "How industrious of you," Miss Marple said gently, "though I understood from Mary, your maid, that she handled the silver this morning, while you were still in bed with a headache." Lady Ada's smile froze delicately. "Perhaps it was yesterday," she murmured. "One forgets." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, rising. "Especially when one wishes to." As she stepped away, she noticed a small bottle of silver cleaner beneath the windowsill, uncorked, the cloth beside it still damp. And it was never the polish, Miss Marple thought. It was always the fingerprints we feared. The Biscuit Club was not known for eloquence, at least, not since the departure of Mrs. Havisham and her theatrical renditions of Devonshire cream etiquette. So it struck Miss Marple as peculiar when Mr. Carraway, a man who rarely spoke more than a sentence at a time, began recounting the last meeting with exceptional precision. "I remember Miss Grove poured the second round of tea," he said thoughtfully. "The tongs were dropped, by Mrs. Biscuit, I believe, and then Percival said something about syllabub, which rather startled everyone. Quite the disruption, really." Miss Marple nodded politely. "Remarkable recall, Mr. Carraway. One might think you were reading from a script." He laughed, but it rang oddly. "Oh no, just a sharp mind. Legal trainedly. Oh no, just a sharp mind. Legal training, you see." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "Though one might expect a sharp mind to note the biscuits, yet you've not mentioned them at all." There was the briefest flicker across his face. "Not guilt, perhaps, but wariness. Did I not? Well, there were quite a few, weren't there? Yes, Miss Marple said softly, though not the ones we were told had been served. She left him standing beside the fireplace, his smile beginning to tremble like a teacup on uneven china. Later that week, Miss Marple paid a condolence visit to the late Mr. Flint's home, a gesture both expected and gently tolerated. The housekeeper, relieved to have company who did not cry or demand explanations, let her into the study with a nod and a weary gesture. He spent most of his time here, the woman said, always scribbling. Even after the club meetings he'd come back and write things down. Miss Marple offered polite condolences and waited until she was alone. The study was orderly, but in a way that betrayed recent fussing. She noticed a waste-paper basket tucked unusually far from the desk, and decided the edge of the hearthrug lifted just enough to reveal the corner of a scatter of crumbs. She knelt with a soft groan. Age required concessions after all, and examined the mess. Crumbs, yes, but not almond, nor rose. These were soft, sugared, fine-piped, lemon meringue perhaps. She lifted one crumb and studied it with quiet thought. It was not what had been served. It was what had been hidden, and perhaps not to Mr. Flint, but from him. Outside, a clock struck 4. Miss Marple stood slowly, brushing her skirt smooth. The crumbs in the carpet told a story the club had hoped to keep swept under the rug, but she had always believed in cleaning beneath things, especially where murder might settle like dust. Miss Marple had always said that a desk, like a teapot, revealed more in its stickiness than in its polish. So when, after a quiet conversation and a carefully brewed pot of Lady Grey, Lady Ada gave her reluctant assent, Miss Marple found herself alone in the late Mr. Flint's study, the air still faintly tinged with pipe tobacco and something faintly medicinal. The roll-top desk was an imposing affair of walnut and dust. Its pigeonholes were methodically arranged, blotting paper stacked, envelopes aligned like soldiers on parade, and a small jar of paper clips whose lid no longer fit. She examined each drawer gently, respectfully, until her hand met resistance. The second drawer on the lower right refused to yield, not because it was stuck. No, it gave slightly, and then caught fast, as though something inside had been fastened shut from within. She tested it again, then stepped back, pressing her fingertips together in thought. A locked drawer in a solicitor's study was not unusual. A drawer locked from within, however, in a man who had recently died, suddenly, with questions left swirling like tea leaves, was another matter altogether. She reached quietly for her hairpin. The lock gave with a soft click, not defiant, merely tired. The drawer slid open an inch, as if exhaling at last. Inside lay a slim book bound in faded blue linen, the word recipes tooled in delicate gilt across the front. It looked precisely as it should, domestic, harmless, slightly stained with time. Miss Marple lifted it with care. The spine creaked softly, like old knees on a staircase. Within she did not find clotted cream ratios or sugar measurements, but letters, dozens of them, folded and tied with a fraying red ribbon. Some bore the elegant hand of earlier decades, others were faintly smudged by what might once have been tears. A few envelopes had been opened and pressed flat again, their contents tucked with tender precision. She placed the book on the desk and untied the ribbon with a gesture that was almost reverent. What kind of man, Miss Marple wondered, kept letters in a recipe book, and what kind of truth must they hold, hidden not in drawers of ledgers or law, but among the sweetness and crumbs of remembered things? She began to read, and the air in the study seemed to shift, not colder, not warmer, simply less at rest. The fourth letter bore a seal cracked clean through the middle, once red, now faded to the color of old jam. Miss Marple unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was large and fluid, the sort that belonged to women of a particular generation, ones who had learned penmanship beside moral instruction. It was addressed to my dearest P, and dated nearly 18 years prior. The tone at first was affectionate, almost conspiratorial in its warmth. But as the letter progressed, the sentences stiffened, the phrasing tightened, like a corset pulled a notch too far. "I cannot in conscience remain silent," the writer declared. The division of Mrs. Bramley's bequest was neither agreed nor just. You and I both know the promise made, and the one betrayed. There was more, accusations artfully woven beneath politesse. One paragraph ended with the words, "And if you will not confess, I must." The sentence had been struck through in thick pencil, as if the writer had regretted it the moment it was written. Miss Marple paused. It was not rage that bled through the page. It was sorrow wounded and long suppressed, and in her long acquaintance with secrets, she had learned sorrow unspoken was the soil from which bitterness most easily grew. Further in the bundle, a letter appeared that had fared far worse. Its upper left corner was singed, the edges curled like autumn leaves too close to a flame. The ash had not consumed it entirely. Someone had extinguished the effort before it succeeded, but the damage was deliberate and unmistakable. Miss Marple opened it with extreme care. The handwriting here was less polished, more hurried, the lines descending with increasing slope as though written in haste or fear. The letter began mid-thought. "Told you, Percival, that if it came to it, I would not remain the scapegoat," and continued with veiled allusions to what was taken, and how Clarice had never known the whole. A list of initials followed, and then the last line, a signature half lost to the scorch. Miss Marple squinted, angling the page toward the window. The tail of the name curled with a finality she recognized. It was Eloise. The surname was gone, reduced to a shadow of ink and smoke, but the hand and the guilt that clung to it remained. So someone had tried to destroy the past, but pasts, Miss Marple thought, were like embroidery threads. Pull one, and the whole pattern begins to show. Tucked at the bottom of the packet, folded separately in vellum, was a letter bearing the unmistakable scrawl of old age, uneven and blotched, yet still determined. The ink had feathered in places, but the message remained intact. It was from Mrs. Bramley. It remained intact. It was from Mrs. Bramley, the club's original benefactor, a woman long dead, her legacy now reduced to portraits in dusty frames and biscuits passed in her name. "My dear friends," it began, "should my strength not return by Easter, I ask that you carry out my intentions with honor. The trust I place in you is not legal, it is moral. Clarice must receive what was promised, not only the funds, but the name. I fear too much has been concealed from her. Let no memory be edited for politeness." Miss Marple held the page a moment longer. There was no ambiguity here, no half measures or veiled insinuation. Mrs. Bramley had been clear, and yet the club had concealed this letter, buried it like a bone best left unearthed. What did it mean, Miss Marple wondered, that a dying woman's clearest wish had gone unfulfilled, and that now another death had come to ensure it remained so? The letters were returned to their blue linen resting place, the ribbon retied, not in deference to secrecy, but to order. Miss Marple stood at the study window, the sun gilding the glass panes in that low, sorrowful way that only late afternoon managed. She no longer doubted that Percival Flint had intended to reveal something, not for revenge or scandal, but for absolution, a reckoning long delayed. Perhaps he had grown tired of the weight of it, or perhaps he had recognized, in Clarice's eyes or Eloise's silence, the cost of history unspoken, but someone else had known. Someone had read those letters before she did. Someone had watched him consider, and had decided that silence must be preserved, even at the price of another's life. Miss Marple stepped back from the desk and gently closed the drawer, the faintest click sounding like a sigh. Murder, she thought, rarely erupted. It gathered, in corners, in letters, in unfinished conversations and recipe books that hid confessions between the folds. And sometimes it came not with fury, but with fear. She looked down at her hands, still composed and very certain now. Whatever had been buried, Percival had tried to unearth it, and someone had buried him to stop it. It was a Wednesday of softened air and trembling leaves, the kind of day that lingered between late summer and something more brittle. Miss Marple walked her habitual path through the churchyard, the gravel muffled by moss and old petals dropped from the memorial vases. She had not come seeking anything, not precisely, but her feet, as they often did, had guided her toward the row beneath the yew. There, among the stone angels and flaking script, she saw Clarice Vale. The widow stood with her head slightly bowed, not praying, but not indifferent either. Her gloved hands were folded beneath her coat, and her silhouette was precise, too precise, against the sunlit haze. Miss Marple approached without sound, but Clarice turned all the same, as though she had expected her. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, "I do hope I'm not in your way." "Not at all, dear," said Miss Marple gently. "It's good to see someone tending the past." Clarice gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "The past is very good at tending itself, I find. It waits, always." And there was something in her voice, not bitterness, but endurance, that made Miss Marple slow her step. They walked a little, the two of them, side by side along the stone wall, where lichen spread like age itself. Clarice spoke softly of the roses that refused to grow in her garden this year, of the new vicar's fondness for imported incense, and how the bells no longer rang quite in tune. Miss Marple listened with interest, though her eyes were drawn now and then to something glinting from Clarice's chest, a small brooch pinned neatly to the edge of her grey cardigan. It was delicately wrought, bronze with a soft patina, shaped in a graceful curl, unmistakably a cinnamon stick. "You don't seem any of those any more," Miss Marple remarked casually. Clarice looked down. "This," she said, touching it lightly. "It was a gift, many years ago." "From your husband?" "No," she said, too quickly, and then softened. "From Mr. Flint, actually. He had a strange fondness for spice motifs. I think he found them comforting." Miss Marple smiled, but something in her gaze sharpened. A cinnamon brooch was not the sort of thing one gave lightly, nor kept, unless the memory still held warmth or warning. Clarice changed the subject, but Miss Marple had already noted what mattered. It was not a conversation that could be forced, but the path they took, curving now toward the boundary wall, where frost first clung in winter, offered its own invitation. "He's buried near the yews," Clarice said, nodding. "It was always his wish. He liked the shade." Miss Marple let the silence linger. "It was sudden, wasn't it?" Clarice exhaled through her nose. "Yes. A full-on black ice. Outside the station, they said." "They said," Miss Marple repeated gently. Clarice was quiet a moment. Then, "It was very late. He had been out with the club. It was the anniversary dinner, I think. He'd rung me from the public house saying he was staying to clear something up with Percival." Her voice wavered at the name. "And then, an hour later, the police came. I remember Miss Marple said they ruled it an accident, but there was no ice elsewhere in the village that night. Just that one stretch by the platform." Clarice looked away. "I'm sure there's no point questioning these things now." Miss Marple nodded. "Only if there's something left to answer." Clarice did not reply, but her hand went to the brooch. as if to steady it. The next afternoon, during a modest tea at Mrs. Biscuits', the conversation turned, as it often did in small parishes, from hymns to rainfall, and from rainfall to reputations. Miss Marple sat with her knitting, unobtrusive as ever, while the vicar's wife described the unfortunate mildew in the organ loft. It was Mrs. Diamond, formerly of Sussex, now widowed and fond of gossip as a dietary supplement, who leaned forward with a confidential air. "Funny thing, Clarice Vale and the club," she said, spooning jam over her pudding with a flourish. "She was rather a favorite once. Used to bring the sugared nut tarts before Mrs. Denham ever came along. Then one day, puff, she was no longer invited." "Really?" Miss Marple asked, with the mildest arch of an eyebrow. "Oh yes. Never said why. Of course, these things never are. But I remember Ada looking very tight-lipped for weeks after." Mrs. Biscuits sniffed. "I thought it was to do with that unfortunate raffle prize confusion." "Oh no," said Mrs. Diamond. "This was much older, 15 years or so." Miss Marple said nothing, only bent to adjust a dropped stitch. But she was no longer knitting patterns. She was unraveling them. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat in her parlor with the village bulletin. Archive balanced upon her knees, thin yellowing pages bound in soft leather and smelling faintly of mildew and mothballs. It had been a gift from the previous librarian upon his retirement, and she had never found a better reference for local inconsistencies. She turned to the year in question, 15 years prior, when the Biscuit Club had celebrated its 10th anniversary with a special meeting at the old rectory, complete with commemorative napkin rings and a speech from Mrs. Grove about digestive unity. There it was, in the May issue. The Honourable Biscuit Circle of Lower Peveril cordially invites its founding members to the Jubilee Tea, Thursday 4 p.m. Guests of honour: Mr. Percival Flint, Miss Agatha Grove, Mrs. Eloise Denham, and Mrs. Clarice Vale. And in the following month's issue, a list of attendees neatly typed, but with Clarice's name struck through in red pencil, and a brief apologetic line beneath. Mrs. Vale was unable to attend. The phrasing was too polished. Miss Marple turned the page. No further mention. Not in the following months, not in the holiday bulletin, not even in the biscuit recipe competition issue. Clarice had vanished from their records like sugar melting in tea. It had not been a scheduling conflict. It had been an erasure, and Miss Marple, who had once stitched together an entire scandal from a misplaced hyphen, knew what such red lines meant. Someone had cut her out, deliberately. The next morning Miss Marple found herself once again at the churchyard wall, where Clarice had taken to feeding sparrows with slow, deliberate motions. She did not look surprised to see her. "You must think me very foolish," Clarice said at last. "Still coming here, still wearing that brooch." "Not foolish," Miss Marple replied. "Steadfast." Clarice laughed, though the sound was dry. The Biscuit Club was meant to be a comfort. We began it with real sincerity, you know. Community, continuity, a place to feel less alone. "It still pretends to be that," said Miss Marple gently. Clarice looked at her then, and there was no pretense in her face. "But it's not," she said. "Not anymore, not for a long time. It became a war, a way to keep the truth out and certain people in." Miss Marple waited. "I never knew what Percy meant to do that night. I didn't even know he had those letters, but I suspected something. You feel it, don't you, when a story's about to break open?" "I do," Miss Marple said softly. "And you were silenced." Clarice folded her hands. "They said I made things inconvenient. I suppose some clubs have found it to preserve memory." She paused. "And others," she added, "to bury it." Miss Marple said nothing, but she knew then beyond doubt that murder had walked in on tea-stained feet, and someone had opened the biscuit tin just wide enough to hide it. The letter arrived, tucked discreetly among the correspondence, plain envelope, government seal, and handwriting that bore the slight backward tilt of Dr. Partridge, the local pathologist. Miss Marple read it slowly, setting her spectacles aside when she reached the final paragraph. Then she folded the letter in half and placed it gently into her bureau drawer, as one might do with a verdict from an old friend. It had been Colonel Melket who arranged the matter, at her suggestion, though he had made a certain noise of disapproval when she first raised it. "Can't go digging up old bones just because of a cough and a biscuit tin, Jane." But the Colonel, for all his bluster, had a respect for instinct, especially hers, and so the discreet request had been made, and the equally discreet autopsy performed. The results were not ambiguous. Traces of digitalis, the report read, consistent with ingestion of foxglove derivative, amount sufficient to induce cardiac arrest, particularly in an elderly man. Miss Marple sat in her parlor, a cup of weak china tea cooling beside her, and watched the steam dissipate in thin, resigned spirals. Foxglove, that most deceptive of plants, lovely in its bells, lethal in its sap. There had been a murder, quiet, controlled, executed not in rage, but in stillness, and that, in her experience, was more dangerous than any dagger. Miss Marple did not walk through Lady Ada's garden as one might a mere arrangement of flora. She observed it as one might read a diary, noting what had been moved, which corners had grown too wild, and which things had been trimmed back with overzealous care. The roses were as splendid as ever, pale peach and dusk red, climbing with abandon across trellises that hadn't been painted since before the war. But it was in a shaded patch near the east-facing hedge, just beyond the wrought-iron gate, that rarely opened, that Miss Marple paused. There, tucked between lupins and lady's mantle, grew a small patch of digitalis. Foxglove, their violet mouths open like silent warnings. They had not been trimmed, nor had they been left to die back. They were fresh, upright, cut perhaps, and trimmed again, not wild, but not quite decorative either. It wasn't a large patch, but it didn't need to be. The bees busied themselves between bells as if nothing were amiss. But Miss Marple stood very still and thought, not of petals but of teacups, and of how very easy it was to gather beauty from danger when one had practiced doing so for years. The image returned to her, vivid now, sharpened by hindsight. The silver biscuit barrel being passed, Percival's momentary cough, and Lady Ada rising quite suddenly to clear the teacups before anyone had finished their second pour. At the time, it had seemed like nothing more than nervous hospitality, the sort Lady Ada specialized in. But now, viewed through the soft film of memory and new knowledge, it struck Miss Marple differently. She had noticed, hadn't she, that Lady Ada did not ask the housemaid to assist, nor did she allow anyone to help carry the tray. She had removed Percival's cup herself, with a smile and a comment about not oversteeping the lapsang this time. It had felt off, not quite wrong, just rehearsed. Now she saw it for what it might have been. Not the action itself, but the urgency within it. Miss Marple reached for her own cup and took a slow sip. Poison, if added to tea, would not linger long, not with guests watching. A teacup removed too quickly was either a kindness or a necessity, and in Lady Ada, she now recalled, had wiped the rim with her handkerchief before lifting it. Too neat, too early, too much. The next morning, Miss Marple made her way around to the service gate of the rectory garden, where she knew she'd find the head gardener at his work. He was a mild man named Norton, not given to chatter, but respectful of those who understood soil. She greeted him kindly and admired the climbing delphiniums before asking, almost as an afterthought, whether he'd been tending the foxglove lately. He blinked. "The foxglove, miss?" "Not me, no. We leave that bed mostly wild." "Still," said Miss Marple gently, "someone's trimmed it recently. I noticed the edges were rather clean, not what one expects from wild things." Norton frowned. "Lady Ada's nephew was about last week. Said he wanted cuttings for the botanical fair, but he wouldn't have taken them without telling me. Would he have known which parts are dangerous?" "I doubt it." Seemed more interested in the coloring. She nodded. "And you?" He scratched at a patch of clay on his cuff. "I know enough not to touch it without gloves. Foxgloves fine for looking at, deaf for tasting." "Quite." She thanked him and left. But what he hadn't asked, and what she had hoped he might, was why she was asking. And silence was often the loudest answer. Miss Marple found Lady Ada that afternoon seated in her drawing-room with her embroidery half finished in her lap and a bowl of candied orange peel untouched beside her. "You've been visiting quite a lot lately, Jane," she said, without looking up. "I do find the air round here very restorative," Miss Marple replied mildly, "though I confess I have been troubled. About poor Percival, about the manner of his death." Lady Ada's hand did not tremble, nor did she reach for the bowl. She merely set aside her needle with the same care she reserved for rose cuttings. "I knew someone would start asking," she said at last. "It always begins with flowers, doesn't it? And ends with whispers, but not from you." "No." She looked up then, eyes calm. "Because loyalty isn't whispering, Jane, it's silence." Miss Marple studied her for a long moment. "And silence, my dear, is a choice." "Yes," said Lady A, "and one I've kept longer than you might imagine." It was not a confession. Not quite. But it was not denial either. Miss Marple rose. She did not press her. Because whatever truth Lady Ada held, she carried it like fine bone china, beautifully, and with quiet, constant weight. That evening, the light in Miss Marple's parlor was thin and amber, the kind that made shadows long and memories precise. She sat with her knitting in her lap, though no stitches had been taken for some time. The autopsy report lay folded beside her tea tray, now gone cool, and though Foxglove had been confirmed, she found herself thinking not of gardens but of motives. Foxglove was simple, common, predictable in its deadliness. It didn't grow malice or whisper betrayal. It merely was, but its use, that spoke volumes. Miss Marple had learned, in her long and quiet life, that true poison rarely began in roots. It brewed in regret. It was stirred by the past, served warm in the language of old allegiances and broken pacts. Someone had killed Percival, not out of hatred perhaps, but out of preservation. A kind of loyalty twisted too tightly. It was not Lady Ada's garden that troubled her now. It was what had been buried beneath it, the secrets, the letters, the memory of a man who had begun, at last, to speak too clearly. The poison may have come from a plant, but the decision, the intention, had come from the heart. And Miss Marple, with hands folded and eyes half lowered, knew she was close now. The cup had been emptied, but the aftertaste lingered still. There was something quietly ceremonial about the way Miss Marple prepared her invitations, not merely out of politeness, but with the steady hand of a woman who understood that ink and paper could carry more than words. They could set a tone, offer a memory, even disarm suspicion. She chose her best cream stationery, the kind with a faint watermark of ivy leaves, and wrote in her finest script, Do come for tea this Thursday at 4. In the old style, with old recipes. Each note was signed simply Jane M. and tied with a narrow blue ribbon. No embellishment, no fuss, just a whisper of nostalgia. The guest list was not long, nor chosen at random. It included only those members of the Biscuit Club who had attended that final meeting with Percival, those who had eaten, or not eaten, from the silver barrel. The notes were hand-delivered that same afternoon by young Tommy Orne, whose mother baked for the Women's Guild, and knew better than to ask questions. Miss Marple gave him sixpence and a currant bun, and he promised to run quick as wind. And thus the table was set, not only for tea, but for truth. Miss Marple's parlour had always been tidy, but on this particular third say, it held the careful symmetry of a scene recalled and rebuilt with purpose. The lace tablecloth was the very one she had used at the Jubilee tea of 1938. Her good china, cream with gold filigree, had been polished. The napkins bore the faint scent of lavender drawer liners, and at the center of it all, resting on a polished wooden tray, lay the biscuits, arranged in the exact assortment served at Percival Flint's final club meeting. There were lemon crisps, almond slices, cinnamon stars, and most notably, a small row of chocolate biscuits piped with vanilla rosettes. They sat at the 12 o'clock position on the tray, unmarred and glistening faintly, as though aware of their role. No one questioned the selection. The guests, Eloise Denham, Mr. Carraway, Mrs. Biscuit, and Lady Ada herself, all accepted tea and praised the lovely spread, though Lady Ada's smile held something faintly tight at the edges. Miss Marple served slowly, carefully. Her hands did not tremble. She had not set a trap. Not exactly, but she had left a trail, and the first crumb, she suspected, was about to fall. The plate made its circuit with practiced grace, handed from palm to palm like a shared secret. Each guest reached politely, some choosing familiar favorites, some hesitating over appearance, some declining with that breathy little chuckle of false restraint. When it reached Mrs. Eloise Denham, she paused, just for a heartbeat. Then, without a word, she reached not for the chocolate biscuit before her, placed precisely within reach, but for a plain oat crisp at the far end of the tray. Her fingers brushed the edge of a napkin as she did so, upsetting nothing but intention. "Not fond of chocolate?" Miss Marple asked mildly, pouring more tea. Eloise smiled. "Oh, I like it well enough, but I find it rather heavy in summer." It was late October. No one commented. The moment passed, or seemed to, but Miss Marple saw the way Eloise's eyes flicked, just once, toward Lady Ada, just once, toward Lady Ada, and how the latter did not look up at all. It was a small thing, a preference perhaps, a matter of taste, and yet the plate had been passed precisely as it had been that day, and just as before, the chocolate biscuit had been left untouched, not by chance, but by fear. Conversation soon settled into that curious tone found only in well-bred gatherings, genteel, meandering, and studiously uncontroversial. They spoke of chrysanthemums in the vicarage beds, the retiling of the vestry roof, and whether Mrs. Lenton's niece had truly married a dentist, or simply claimed to. But it was Lady Ada who, with the faint air of reminiscing, brought up the village fairs of years gone by. "Do you remember the 1990 fête?" she said, stirring her tea with absent precision. "Clarice Vale's brother organized the sack races, and someone stole the lemon curd." Mrs. Biscuit laughed. "That was the year of the rain, ruined the scones completely." Miss Marple, refilling Mr. Carraway's cup, said with polite curiosity, "I don't believe I was here for that one. 1919 was it? An unlucky summer by all accounts. Oh, dreadful, said Eloise Denham too quickly. And then silence. She had not been addressed. No one had asked her. Yet her voice had risen, defensive, abrupt. Miss Marple glanced at her teacup, resting untouched on its saucer. It had the faintest film of dust near the rim, not from neglect, but from hesitation, as if the conversation had disturbed something long buried, and something now was beginning to stir. Miss Marple let the lull stretch a moment longer, long enough for nerves to tighten, but not so long as to draw protest. Then, with the gentleness of someone plucking a thread from a sleeve, she asked, "Did you lose someone that year, Mrs. Denham?" Eloise's smile stiffened. "A cousin," she said. "My mother's side died tragically. I'd rather not speak of it." Miss Marple nodded, eyes lowered. "Was it an illness?" "No, an accident. A terrible one." She looked away. "He choked. On a sweet, I believe. Chocolate. At a church picnic." There was a pause. "A biscuit, perhaps?" Miss Marple suggested, her tone still light, almost distracted. Eloise did not answer. Her hand, so dainty and composed, clenched suddenly on her lap. "I was quite young," she said finally, "barely 7. But I remember the sound." No one breathed for a moment. Miss Marple offered a sympathetic murmur and reached to refill the sugar bowl, as though nothing had passed. But something had. Not just the memory, but the aversion. It had not been a dislike. It had been a trauma, or so the story wished to seem. But Miss Marple's mind, seasoned by decades of human frailty, sensed the trembling shadow of guilt beneath the grief. Miss Marple sat back, her cup resting lightly in her saucer, and regarded Eloise with the calm gaze of someone who had long since abandoned surprise for understanding. She had seen it before, the way grief spoke too loudly, too neatly, like a child rehearsing sorrow in the mirror. But guilt was quieter. It avoided chocolate biscuits not from distaste, but from memory. "You were 7, she said softly. "And yet you remember the sound." Eloise blinked. "I said that, didn't I?" "Yes," said Miss Marple, "and it struck me as curious, because most children don't remember tragedy in detail. They remember colors, perhaps, the smell of grass or the feel of a hand pulling them away, but not sound. I've always had a sharp memory," she said, with a fluttering smile. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, a sharpness born of fear, I think. Or perhaps from having seen something you weren't meant to see." Eloise stood. "I really should be going." "No one blamed you then," Miss Marple said, still gently. "But I believe you've been punishing yourself ever since." Eloise turned. Her composure cracked just slightly. "I didn't mean—" "Perhaps not," said Miss Marple. "But intent is not always the same as innocence." And with that, the silence settled once more. But this time, it told the truth. It was the sort of telephone call that passed unnoticed by the world, polite, clipped, and entirely forgettable, save for the person who placed it, and the one who answered. "Mrs. Denham, Jane Marple here. Forgive the bother, but I've discovered I still have one of your teaspoons. The little one with the barley twist handle, quite distinctive. Would you be free to collect it this afternoon?" There was a pause, brief but audible. "Yes, I suppose I could," came the reply, voice carefully neutral. "Around 4, perfect," said Miss Marple, her tone cheerful. "And do stay for a cup of tea. I've tried a new lavender biscuit recipe. I'd be grateful for your verdict." She replaced the receiver with a faint click, then returned to her knitting. There was stillness in the room, the kind that settles just before a change in weather. Outside, the sky darkened by degrees. Inside, the teaspoon sat gleaming on the tray, never borrowed and never meant to be returned. Mrs. Denham arrived precisely on time, her shoes polished and her hat at the correct angle. as if punctuality might still erase something deeper. She removed her gloves at the door, lace, ivory, delicate, but as she sat in the parlor, she placed them neatly on her lap, fingers still curled slightly inward. They rested there, unmoving, like two pale moths pinned behind glass. Miss Marple poured the tea without comment. The lavender biscuits were crisp and fragrant, flecked with candied peel. Eloise took one, held it a moment, then placed it back on the saucer, untouched. They sat in companionable silence, broken only by the distant call of a wood pigeon and the faint hum of the parlor clock. Miss Marple, appearing to study her needlework, stole a glance at the folded hands. There was no tremor, no twitch, only a too careful stillness, as though by sheer will alone, Eloise might keep memory and motive from rising to the surface. And yet, stillness speaks, in its way, louder than fear. The third biscuit crumbled slightly at the edge. Miss Marple brushed the crumbs away and spoke, almost conversationally. "I've always found it curious how the past hides in plain sight, like sugar spilled on a windowsill. Eventually the ants find it." Eloise said nothing. "You see, when Percival unlocked that drawer, he wasn't hiding something. He was preparing to show it. The letters, the ones tied with the pale blue ribbon, they were placed deliberately, and among them, the one with the broken seal, the one about the bequest." Miss Marple lifted her gaze. Funds had gone missing, a quarrel buried too long, but someone else had kept a copy, hadn't they? Percival knew, so did Clarice's husband, Eloise's husband. Eloise's jaw tensed, but she did not interrupt, and the fire, or rather the attempt at one, a letter singed but not destroyed, a name barely readable. She paused, then added gently, "You tried to erase it, but even ash leaves a mark." Eloise reached for her gloves, then let her hand drop. The silence lengthened, and Miss Marple waited, not with expectation, but with the quiet patience of someone who has spent her life watching the world unraveling gestures, not words. When Eloise finally spoke, her voice was thin, like old lace worn at the edges. "He was drunk, you know, that night. Clarice's husband. He came round to the vicarage after the fete, raving about Percival, about money, about what he'd found." She pressed her hands together, tightly, now, as though warming them. "I didn't mean to, not at first, but he wouldn't stop talking. He said he'd tell the papers, that the whole village should know what sort of club we were running. I tried to reason with him." Miss Marple nodded gently, but reason seldom works with the deeply aggrieved. Eloise's smile was at one. "I opened the gate. It had rained, and the path was slick with black ice." He stumbled. "I didn't call for help." Her eyes remained dry. Clarice never guessed. She thought it was an accident. Everyone did. I told myself it was an accident, after all. But I knew better. "And Percival?" Miss Marple asked softly. Eloise exhaled. "He remembered too much. He started to ask questions. I couldn't let it begin again." There was no drama in her tone, only weariness. Some women cry. Others carry their tears like heirlooms, hidden, preserved, but never spent. "I didn't hate him," Eloise said, almost dreamily, as if surprised by her own words. "Percival, he was dull, self-important, and terribly fond of nutmeg. But I didn't hate him." Miss Marple sipped her tea. She knew better than to interrupt a confession once it had begun to breathe. "I feared him," Eloise continued, "not because he was cruel, but because he was correct, always. And if he found out, if he published those records, told the committee about the bequest, it would have shattered everything." She smoothed her skirt absently. "We built something, you see, the Biscuit Club. It wasn't just about baking, it was about forgetting, preserving a kind of gentility." She looked up then, and her eyes were suddenly sharp. And I killed him, not out of rage, but to stop the truth from entering the room. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Preservation, she murmured, can be its own kind of hunger. There was a knock at the door, soft, courteous. Miss Marple rose and admitted Inspector Cray, who stepped in with the air of someone who already knew he would not be resisted. Eloise stood. She adjusted her gloves with precise, almost reverent care, then reached for her shawl, a pale cashmere, embroidered at the hem with forget-me-nots. I suppose, she said, with a small sigh, you'll want to speak with me elsewhere. Cray inclined his head. If you please, madam. Eloise turned once to Miss Marple. Thank you for the tea, she said with a smile as brittle as spun sugar. Miss Marple did not reply, only met her gaze with a tenderness untouched by pity. And then she was gone, a woman cloaked in elegance and ruin, leaving behind the scent of talcum, old violets, and something deeper still. It lingered faint and bitter, like a biscuit too long on the tray. Not hate, not madness, only a sorrowful kind of order, the kind that keeps murder neatly dressed and gloved. The Biscuit Club met no more. No formal notice was sent, no announcement made, merely a slow unraveling, like the unpicked edge of a hem no one had the courage to stitch again. The table in the parish hall remained folded against the wall, the embroidered cloth left in its drawer. The recipe books, once meticulously passed hand to hand, lay quietly unopened in their owners' cupboards. They might have continued, of course, out of habit, or pride, or the English sense of stoic continuity, but something had shifted, as if a curtain long drawn had been lifted just a little, and what it revealed was enough to curdle the cream. Politeness remained, as always. There were nods in passing, brief pleasantries at the greengrocer's counter, half-smiles exchanged across pews, but the laughter, the true unguarded kind, had retreated, and no one, not even Lady Ada, called for another meeting. It was not shame, precisely. Rather, the dull, persistent ache of knowledge that made gathering feel inappropriate, like celebrating the harvest after finding stones in the wheat. Thus the club ended not with scandal, but with silence, the gentlest and perhaps most enduring kind of disbandment. Lady Ada's drawing-room remained unchanged. Floral upholstery, a fire too well-mannered to crackle, and that faint scent of rosewood polish that clung to every edge. The tray, as always, was silver, but this time there were only 2 teacups upon it. She poured with practiced grace, her hand steady despite all that had passed. No sugar, Jane? Miss Marple smiled. Just a half, thank you. They sipped in silence, and it was Lady Ada who spoke first. Do you think it was worth it? Her voice was quiet, not defeated, but tempered by something less easily named, a fatigue that did not touch the body. To have stirred all that sorrow again, for what in the end? Justice. Miss Marple did not answer at once. She looked at the lace curtain trembling slightly in the draught, then at the delicate rim of her cup, where the tea left a faint, perfect ring. I have wondered, Lady Ada continued, whether some truths once buried ought to remain so. Eloise was not unkind. She was frightened. She meant to preserve something. A memory, Miss Marple asked. No, Lady Ada said softly. A lie, but a very gentle one. Miss Marple turned her cup slowly between her fingers, that motion quiet and rhythmic, like a thought winding its way into form. You know, Ada, she said, when I was a girl there was a housekeeper who brewed tea so strong it could have tanned leather. She always poured it too soon. Impatient, you see. My aunt used to say, truth is like Darjeeling. You must let it steep before it's worth drinking. Lady Ada's brow lifted slightly. Too soon, and it's bitter. Too late, and it's cold, but just right. It clears the senses. brings color back to the mind. There was a pause. "I don't believe truth must always be shouted," Miss Marple went on, "but I do believe it must be faced, eventually, otherwise it spoils everything else, even the quiet happiness one tries so hard to preserve." Lady Ada's gaze drifted toward the window. "Yes," she said finally. "It does." She poured the last of the tea into Miss Marple's cup and said, not quite meeting her eyes, "And if it is truth that sours the tongue, perhaps it is memory that sweetens it again." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That is why we add a little sugar." The next day the village newsletter arrived, hand-folded, slightly askew as it always was. Most skimmed it between buttering toast or folding laundry, but this issue contained a small surprise in the center column, a recipe. Not a new one, not the latest trend from London or some continental delicacy from Mrs. Faraday's niece in Marseille. No, it was Percival's biscuit recipe, the same one he had brought, year after year, to the Biscuit Club's summer meeting. A delicate walnut biscuit with a hint of orange peel and the tiniest brush of cinnamon. Few had loved it, truthfully. It was fussy to make, easy to overbake. But it had been his, and it had carried the pride of his apron with every batch. The recipe was printed in full, in Lady Ada's own hand. Beneath it, in small italics, was the dedication "For old friendships not forgotten," and for those who knew how to hold a secret long enough to preserve a village, but not so long as to ruin it. Miss Marple, reading it by the hearth in St. Mary Mead, folded the page with quiet care. It was, she thought, as much a eulogy as any carved in stone. Miss Marple left early the next morning, her carpet-bag neatly packed with her knitting, and the village newsletter folded twice within a worn paperback. Lady Ada had pressed a small jar of pear and ginger conserve into her hands at the gate. "Do write," she'd said, as if they were cousins parted for the season. Miss Marple had nodded and promised she would. As she stepped down the gravel path, the breeze shifted, gentle but insistent. It stirred the lavender bushes, lifted the hem of her coat, and nudged the iron garden gate into motion. It swung open with barely a whisper, not a creak, not a groan, as though in all its years it had never known the strain of secrets. She paused only once, half turning, not to look at the house, but at the garden. Foxgloves stood tall in the corner, their purple bells swaying lightly. Nothing had been uprooted, and that perhaps was the point. Miss Marple continued down the lane. St. Mary Mead awaited, and along with a loose thread in her sleeve, a new jar of plum jam to test, and a letter she had yet to write. But in her mind, the gate still swung silently, politely, as if nothing at all had happened. And perhaps, in a way, nothing had. Only tea and the truth. Sometimes the most devastating truths are not shouted, but steeped gently, like Darjeeling, allowed to settle until clear. In this quiet tale, we've seen how a single chocolate biscuit, a garden gate, and an old recipe can become instruments of memory and mourning. Miss Marple never judges, not in the way others might. She simply listens beneath what is said, between the pauses, in the gestures of those who fold their hands too neatly or glance away too quickly. And in the end, justice did not arrive with sirens, but with a shawl, a sigh, and the soft closing of a door. It makes one wonder, if you knew the truth would ruin everything gentle and good about a person's legacy, would you speak it aloud, or let it rest quietly beneath the garden gate? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear what you felt about Eloise, about Percival, about what was preserved and what was broken. Would you have made the same choice Miss Marple did, to reveal, but with grace? Or would you have let the past remain folded away like an old club newsletter? Your comments bring these mysteries to life, and help other thoughtful listeners discover them too. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of the quiet weight of memory or the cost of secrets kept too long, please consider subscribing for more elegant tales just like this one. And share this story with a friend who loves slow, thoughtful mysteries where every silence hides a clue. Until next time, stay curious and always, always notice the smallest things.